Today. Typical London weather and everything is fine, so great to be back. And I want to tell you a story about a 11-year-old boy who in 1983 got himself a Spectra video computer that was running a very, very early version of Microsoft Basic. And as every sort of 11, 12-year-old kid would do the first time he got into programming was write something like this. We've all been there, we've all done it. This computer he had, it was a Spectra Video SVI 318. It had a chiclet-style rubbery keyboard that was terrible to write on. And it had sort of a keypad onto the right, but it came with this little plastic thingy that you could pop in and it became a joystick, so it could be used for games as well. And there weren't that many games around for it, so he had to teach himself programming. And a year later, he was 12 at the time, he had written this piece of code, and pay attention to its very economic use of white space. There is none. But that was because this was sent into a computer magazine called PC and Office Technology that was published in South Africa. And it came on print in the December 1984 issue. Now, believe it or not, this sending things in to be printed in the magazine and then typed off the page into your computer was a very common way to distribute software at the time. So this is obviously the source code for a game. This is the game. It's called Blaster. And it sort of looks fairly similar to some of the other games around at the time. It had a concept of you controlling this little spaceship, shooting aliens that were evading, having something called status beams. Very scary stuff. Don't know what that is. But this was, of course, written by the 12-year-old Elon Musk. So some of the first code that he ever wrote, and he said that he probably wouldn't have started programming if it hadn't been for video games. And he wouldn't have been as interested in computers and technology if it hadn't been for video games. And he thought that getting kids interested in programming and technology had way bigger knock-on effects that many people realize. And I think with 12-year-old Elon Musk, on the words of its teenage years, is a very good place to start this story about the marvels of teenage engineering. So we are going to be going around the world and hearing stories about teens making big waves from their bedrooms, teaching themselves programming and doing marvelous stuff. And this story starts out in the Soviet Union, back in the mid-80s. Now, this one is a Electronica 60 computer that was made by Electronica Voronezh in the Soviet Union. It's actually a Western computer. It's a clone of the digital PDP-11, but it's, or it was Soviet-made. Fairly good computer for the time. It was a 16-bit computer, had 64 megabytes of RAM, and this was the computer the original Tetris game was written on. And Tetris was written by this guy, Alexei Platyo, I think his name was. He was not a teenager at the time. He was 29 when he wrote Tetris. And he wrote that in the Pascal programming language. Now, Pascal was sort of the programming language, the national programming language in Soviet Russia. They even had their own translation of it, in which the keywords were in Soviet Russian. And the thing was, the first job I ever did in computing, and I'm from Norway, was doing some VB script macros for Microsoft Word. And believe it or not, that version of Microsoft Word, they translated the VB scripting language into Norwegian, so I can totally relate to programming Pascal in Russian. But had it not been for a teenager, 16-year-old, called Vadim Gerasimov, the guy on the picture here, Tetris might not have been the success story it is known as today. Because Vadim was a student at a high school, Arkady Borovsky, Please pardon my Russian pronunciation. I'm not very familiar with the language at all. But he studied computer science and maths there. And he was working with his computer science and maths teacher, writing an encryption program for MS-DOS, which is a fairly advanced thing to be doing 16 years old. And he was discovered by Dmitry Pavlovsky, who was a colleague of the creator of Tetris. And Mr. Pavlovsky showed him some games that he himself had written. And the day after, Vadim came back and re-implemented them, or ported them, as we would say, to MS-DOS. And so he got the opportunity to actually rewrite Tetris from the PDP clone to MS-DOS. He also redid the entire thing, so it was in color. He was the one who introduced the blocks and everything. And had it not been for that, this game probably wouldn't have made it through the Iron Curtain, through Hungary, then onto UK, to become this sort of breakaway success that Tetris is today. So Vadim Gerasimov, the reason why Tetris became the success it was. So don't just hate it when this happens, when you get that ransomware thing going in the middle of your talk. So this has a bit of history to it. Today, things like this is fairly serious, where you get that on your computer. But it used to be much lighter back around the early 90s. I'm going to tell you the story about Neil McAllister. Neil McAllister was a 16-year-old punk, proper punk from San Francisco. His sort of pastime hobby was blowing up public phone booths with firecrackers. Can relate to doing that at age 16. But he also had an IBM XT clone in his bedroom. And he had this with a modem connected. And the other thing he used to do was dial up something called bulletin board systems. Now, bulletin board systems were the social media of the time. So you could dial up another computer, connect to message boards and discuss things with other people. And he found this really interesting. The one thing he disliked were sort of these elite people, elite programmers who were into making computer viruses, and they were always going on about how good they were and how good the viruses was. And he wasn't impressed at all. And one virus that was making or getting a lot of attention at the time was one written by Dr. Teresa Goody called the AIDS virus. And this was at the height of the AIDS pandemic. AIDS was a real serious disease then, because you did not have sort of the treatments that we have today, so you can actually have a worthy life and living with AIDS. It was a death sentence at the time. So it was not a very good name for a virus at all. But the thing that Neil McAllister sort of found troublesome about it was that it was written in Turbo Pascal. So it was very big, it was weighed in at 14 kilobytes. So you can very easily detect if any files were infected with this virus because they sort of blew up in size. So he wanted to do something similar. He wanted to make his own virus, and he had the plans out for this. He wanted to create a virus named after his favorite band's album. That was Death. You can see their album cover on the left-hand side of the screen there, called Leprosy. So, but he also was into sort of occultism. Hellraiser was a favorite film, so we wanted this to be 666 bytes big. Only one problem, he didn't know a thing about programming. He did not know how to program computers, so he had to teach himself the entire thing in his bedroom. So he did. He managed to create this virus, Leprosy. When you ran it, nothing happened. But if the date somehow got to any Friday the 25th, something strange would happen. You would get this message flashing up. And if you try turning it off and on again, it will still be there. So this was sort of the leprosy virus that he wrote. And he taught himself how to do this by using Peter Norton's Pink Shirt book, which was sort of the Bible on programming the IBM PC. But he also wanted this to be really small, so he came across a article in PC Magazine about how to write your own sort of C bootstrapper, getting away with all the argument handling and stuff that we do today to reduce this in size. Sat down, wrote his virus in C. This is the original source code for this. You can see down here that this is the place where it finds the other files to infect and all that. So this was the original leprosy virus. He also wrote documentation for this. So this is the documentation for the leprosy virus that he uploaded when he distributed this to the bulletin boards he used to hang out on. He wanted this to be open source, so this was one of the first open source viruses. Of course, you do a documentation for such a project, and when it's done, he uploaded it, he forgot about it, and he wasn't really content yet, because he hadn't managed to get this down to 666 bytes, so he kept on doing this. And a few years later, he released Leprosy Strain 2. This time, he had rewritten the entire thing in assembly language, managed to squeeze it down to 666 bytes. He also invented sort of code-based encryption on this, so the virus wasn't that easy to detect. Again, open sourcing it, writing the documentation, uploading it, and forgetting about it entirely. Until this sort of reappeared in 40 hex, which was a underground fanzine for computer virus programmers in the early 1990s, in which, in the very first issue, they had a feature on this one and told everyone how to use these techniques. And these were the techniques that were used by more serious computer viruses coming after it. So we could say that his little open source project, it truly went viral on 1990s social media.
Shall we play a game?
Now on sale, it's disk drive building.
It's in the design phase.
WISN-TV, Milwaukee. This is Channel 12 Action News.
The FBI this afternoon confirmed it is investigating members of a Milwaukee area computer club.
Having successfully tapped in to the computer of the Nuclear Weapons Research Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico.
Milwaukee man under investigation reportedly said breaking into the computer system was, quote, really easy to do.
How easy was it? Very, very easy.
So, we are going to Milwaukee sometime around the time when the film War Games came out. And War Games had introduced computer hacking to the general public. And in Milwaukee, there were some kids. It was Timothy Winslow. He was 16 years old. And Neil Patrick, around the same age. Together with an older boy called Gerald Wanderer, they sort of founded a computer club. And they met at something called the Explorer Scouts. Now, the Explorer Scouts were scouts exploring technology and computers instead of the wild woods and nature. And so they got together, and they were inspired by the local street gangs of Milwaukee. And the street gangs of Milwaukee would use like street numbers for the names. So we had 9s and 7s, competing for territory to do whatever they did, sell whatever they sold. So they used the Milwaukee area code, which was 411. Called themselves the 411s, and inspired by the War Games film, they sat down and wrote a little program to just start dialing up phone numbers and trying different phone numbers and seeing if there was a computer at the other end answering. And they ran this at night when they had a list of computers. They tried dialing them up and tried logging in. And lo and behold, they managed to log in. They first got into the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, managed to delete some patient records. Whoops. Then into a bank, a cement company, a taxidermy company. who were online in the early 80s. That was pretty early for that, I guess. But then something happened because they managed to get into the research center at Los Alamos, which was the military facility. And they suddenly started experiencing sort of strange things. There were clicking noises on their telephone lines, and then one fine morning, the FBI raided their houses. And the problem was they probably hadn't done much wrong because the US didn't have any laws against computer crimes at the time. So hacking was not a thing. So they got charged with a minor misdemeanor of making prank telephone calls. And a year later, the United States got their very first sort of computer crime laws, and we have these guys to thank for that. So that's the 411s from Milwaukee. So this might look vaguely familiar to some of you. This is a game called Dangerous Dave and Copyright Infringement. It's heavily inspired by another game called Super Mario. But this is the start of an empire within computer games. So Dangerous Dave was a franchise that was created by John Romero, which might be a familiar name to some of you. And one of his programmers, a 16-year-old at the time, 17 maybe, called John Carmack, wrote this little prototype, which they sent to Nintendo, trying to get a license on creating a PC version of the Super Mario game, which Nintendo weren't that interested in. They were more in the hardware business, so they didn't want to do that. But let's talk about why this is important. But before that, we have to go to the School of Teenage Engineering and talk a bit about how video games are made, or were made at the time. So this is how you would build sort of the worlds behind you. You would have these little squares of, for example, 48 by 48 pixels that were the sprites you would build this from. This might look like something you modern people call CSS sprites. And it's basically the same concept. So you would have those, and you would sort of draw your world by puzzling together these different pieces on a grid, which would be your background. So game world would look something like this. You could divide it into squares, and John Carmack wrote this. So this is the source code for a technique that he sort of invented called adaptive tile refresh. And it's all about keeping track of where any action on the screen happens so that you don't have to redraw the entire thing, but you can only change the things that have changed from last time around. This made things way faster, so it made it possible to get that smooth scrolling thing. So this is what Wikipedia tells you. If you go on and try to read about why John Carmack is sort of a programming legend, they tell you he invented this. There's another thing, though, in this, because there's a way more important thing in this little prototype, and that's what you see and what you don't see. So if you imagine, this is the screen where you have the viewport of what you're actually seeing, and this was the extended graphics adapter for the IBM PC, which was a bit special from what came before it, because you could also have pieces off screen, so to the left hand and the right hand sides of the screen, you could have these little extra bits. And John Carmack figured this out, so you could draw some of these tiles on the right hand side and the left hand side, and then you can move things in 1 pixel increments sideways. Nobody had done that before. And this actually got them into the Guinness Book of Records in 1991. So Wikipedia is not the source for this. Go to the Guinness Book of Records, much more trustworthy. But the follow-up, Commander Keen and the Invasion of the Watercons, is in the Guinness Book of Records as the first smooth-scrolling game on the PC, which has sort of a legacy to it. It also made them able to brag in their advertising that it makes an IBM outshine an Amiga. And for those of you who don't know what an Amiga is, It's one of the two sort of important 16-bit computers of the late 1980s. So there were two at the time who were fairly similar. Both had the Motorola 68000 processor in them. You have the Commodore Amiga on the left-hand side and the Atari ST on the right-hand side. These were not the same machines. The Amiga was vastly superior to the Atari ST, and that is illustrated fairly well by the legendary 1989 game Shadow of the Beast by Psygnosis. British made this. You have the Amiga version, which looks way better than the Atari ST version. And the Atari version is so slow that they weren't even able to have music on it. That's why I can play them both at the same time, and it still sounded good. So this was Shadow of the Beast. So, how come on the Atari ST, 17-year-old Swede Nicholas Tissell wrote the game Enchanted Lands for Italian software, and it looks like this. It has, I'm trying to count, but there are more than the 16 colors that the ST was able to display at the time on screen. And it scrolls really smoothly. There are parallax layers and everything in there. So, so this was something that was virtually impossible to do. And before we get into how he actually managed, we have to talk about the options of screens you had when you bought your Atari computer. Because you could go for the high-resolution black and white screen or the color screen with a fairly lower resolution. And one important detail here is that the black and white one had a 71.25 refresh rate, while the other one was 50, at least here in Europe. In the States, it was 60, because this is tied in with the switching rate of the electricity grid, which is 50 here, 60 there. But what happened? If you changed it to 60 in Europe, it would stretch the screen vertically. So the thing that just happened, that would happen. We have to go back to school, back to class, because we have to talk about vintage technology for this to make any sense now. So this thing here is something called a television set. You might have seen something like this at your parents' house or somewhere else, but it's one of those things you used to look at, and you get your entertainment from this. It had something inside it called a cathode ray tube, that's or a CRT screen, and that would actually mean that you had an actual ray gun in the middle of your living room firing beams towards you. So you were sat, the ray gun was at the back, it fired beams towards a fluorescent screen at the top, forming an image. You had strong magnets onto the side that would sort of bend the beam so that it could move and draw the image you saw from the top hand left corner and then down, and do this 50 times per second. So this was what a television was like back in the day. So here is Nicholas and his gang. He was in a computer club in Sweden called the Care Bears. Nicholas is the one on the circle here. He was 17 years old when he started working for Italian Software, creating this game. But before that, he had invented this technique. And we are going to see some actual assembler language programming now. I'll carry you through this, but this is going to be rather mind-boggling. So if you are not able to follow along all the time, just keep in mind that it took a 16-year-old without any internet access or anything to actually figure this out. So pay attention to the red line here, because that's the electron beam passing over the screen and drawing the image. And the Atari ST had this black sort of frame around the image, so you could only display graphics on part of the screen. But one of the things that he figured out was that if he switched between the higher black and white screen and then the 50 Hertz color one, he could open up the left-hand side frame border. And when sort of the electron beam passed on a bit further, He could stabilize that, and if it did this again a bit later, then switching back to black and white and back again, he could open up the right-hand side border and then just carry on, stabilize at the end, and when he got to the end of the line, just figure out what to do next, in which case he had a long table of different options. But you can see at the very right, there are different offsets. And the numbers you're seeing are sort of the bytes that this changes the video memory size by. So by combining these and just using 5 or 6 lines of drawing the screens and changing the size of the video memory, he was able to offset the screen position and do hardware-based scrolling or software-based hardware scrolling on a computer with no graphics hardware. So that's a bit mind-boggling, so I'll say that again. It was software-based hardware screen scrolling on a computer with no graphics hardware, which is fairly good. So 17 years old. Let's have some local bonus content for the UK, shall we? Come on. You don't want this, do you? So, at the time when Nicholas and the Care Bears came up with this, there was a gang of boys out in West London known as the Lost Boys. And they entered into a telefax war with these Swedes during the summer of 1990. And so they were sending faxes back and forth with insults until the Brits came up with this thing, sort of the ultimate insult. Graphic violence on screen, sorry, I should have warned you before. But where they properly killed off a Care Bear in a splatter movie style. So the Lost Boys, they were really into, they had a name from the vampire film, they were really into heavy metal and computer programming. Now, these boys were even younger. 2 of them, brothers, the Moss brothers, were around 14, 15 at the time. And Tim Moss, the older one, did not know how to program. He had no training at all, but he was very inspired by seeing all of these things that the other kids were doing on something called the demo scene, which was all about showing off your programming skills. And in 1989, they released this thing. It's called Oh Crikey, What a Scorcher. And this is the sort of main menu, which was a 3D game that you had to fly through. Again, this is the Atari ST computer that wasn't capable of anything, and 16-year-old Tim Moss managed to write this. He was naturally hired by Italian Software. So this is Tim in the red circle there, and he and his brother were hired by Italian. They did this game. It's called Prehistoric Tale. Tim did the programming, his brother did the graphics, there was some German doing the music and everything. It's not the best game, but the thing is that Thalion had used that technique that Nicholas Tissell had come up with to scroll the screen to do encryption of the software to make it hard to copy and pirate. So they had something that used the same sort of synchronizing and switching and everything and time-based thing. And there were some others. So the Pompeii Pirates, also from Britain, were the first one to crack the copy protection of that and distribute this. So the fax wars of 1989 went on to be way more serious between the Lost Boys making this game and the Pompeii Pirates making it available for everyone not to buy. So that was Britain.
Ladies and gentlemen,
let's go back in time. Specifically to August 1st, 1981, where something really, really important happened. MTV launched. So MTV came on, and MTV was to change popular culture. Way back in the day, they actually played music, not just reality shows. And one of the longest running shows, or the longest running show on MTV actually, was the party zone that went on every Saturday from midnight until 3 in the morning. After that, the chill out zone came on because it was time to come down. But they used to show techno music with sort of these psychedelic backdrops on them on for hours. You used to watch this and be dazzled by it. And in 1992, a Norwegian bunch of programmers called Spaceballs made this. So, highly inspired by the music videos they've seen, they created a music video on the Commodore Amiga that looked like this. And this was something that no one had seen before because you had all of these videos. It was obviously vector graphics, but no one had thought about doing that. So this was a revolution. It got loads of attention at the time. It was programmed by this guy, Paul Anderson, 16. And this was his girlfriend. This was his girlfriend's friend. And this was them trying to come up with a follow-up for this one. Because when you've done something revolutionary, people expect you to do something even better. So this was them in front of their local schools, just stood in front of a white wall and filming this. So the girls dancing to go on and create this thing that was released the year after, called Nine Fingers. And here, one of the Paul Anderson wrote the software to digitize that into vector graphics. So the video they had filmed, and this was a time where digitizing video was something that you generally didn't do. You had to have professional sort of broadcast service level equipment to even get a digital version of things. So he built it himself, wrote the software to encode it into vector graphics, and they made this thing. And it still looks fairly good. And we'll get back to this, but we have to go back to the UK and meet Dylan Cuthbert. So Dylan's first computer was a ZX Spectrum. And as he said, when you got one of those things, you didn't really get any games with them. So you had to program all the games yourself. I'm not sure if he's a Yorkshireman, but he was like, oh, we had it worse. We had to program all the games ourselves, or something like that. So, anyway, there was a company here in the UK called Argonaut Software. Their thing was to put a 3D engine in just about everything. And Dylan sent in some things he had created around the age of 15. There, got a phone call the day after and was called in to start working for them. And the first gig he got was to reverse engineer the software development kits for the Nintendo Game Boy, because Argonaut were going to put a 3D engine in the Game Boy. The Game Boy being a gaming device so slow that it couldn't redraw the entire screen at once. He had to do it in 2 goes. So he had to soldier the kit to do that, and then he went on to build the 3D engine that was used in this game called X. And Nintendo was so impressed by this that they actually brought Dylan, at the time aged around 17, over to Japan to work on the first sort of proper 3D game for the Super Nintendo game system. And Dylan went on to design a small chip that would go in the game cartridges that you would put into your machine, called the Mathematical Argonaut Rotation and Input-Output Processor, or Mario for short, that was used in the legendary game Star Fox to have proper 3D graphics on the Super Nintendo. So, designed by a 17-year-old. Now, Lillehammer Olympics, Winter Olympics 1994. There was a game company in Oslo called Funcom. They're known for being ridiculously late with every single game they are producing. So they didn't manage to have this out in time. But 2 years later, they released Winter Gold for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. This might look familiar to you all. And this was programmed by Paul Anderson. and it had 3D graphics that no one had seen anything like before. And the reason for that was that this wasn't a traditional 3D engine. This was more on a rails game where this was digitized 3D video using the techniques he had come up with for his music video from a couple of years earlier, and even having his girlfriend in dancing for the game as well. So, and that's where the marvels of British and Norwegian teenage engineering meet to create this little beauty. So I think that's a good one. So this here is Jordan Mechner, and he could be a fairly famous name to some of you. He had one dream in his life, and that was to create something that would be filmed by Hollywood. He's gotten there, so I'm not sure what he's doing these days. But this is him in his room, 16 years old. And I guess at the time he was working on this, which was his first game. It's called Death Bounce. It was created for the Apple II computer. It's a fairly good game. This was never released, but it's sort of a space shoot 'em up with physics engine and all in there. But the interesting thing about Dill is that he kept meticulous journals, so we can look back and get fairly good insight into what he was thinking at the time. And the DS box that he's played a game called Quicks, and then he sees an article in a magazine called Creative Computing about generating random numbers. And he gets the idea for Death Bounce somehow from that. And then he starts thinking about, okay, if I manage to sell 1,000 copies of this, I will make, it isn't that much money. But if I sell 5,000, I will be stinking rich. So it really inspires him to go on, gets on, starts writing this in BASIC, realize that that isn't efficient enough, starts redoing the thing, or refactoring, as we should say, to assembler language code, and then discovering things like dual page animation to make things smooth, and has to redo everything again, keeps working on this game of his, and it all started from this Creative Computing magazine. This was the source code he read. And again, this was the way of distributing software at the time. He would type it off the page. But this was what actually sparked the game. And towards the end, before this one is finished, it was never properly released, you can see that he has a diary entry where it has a to-do list. So he needs to finish the game module, clean up the code, then test, 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 and then just add the remaining features. And it's just like all of the projects we do. It's like we just have to clean up our code, we have to get things tested, and then add all the other stuff, all the features. So, so that's what teenagers were doing back in the 80s that we are rediscovering and calling agile these days. This is not a teenager, because he's only 11 years old, or was at the time, Chris Mehera. And he's known for having created an iPad game, which is this one. It's a fairly simple game, but he wrote this on his own and got a fair bit of attention from it. This is him giving a TED talk. I haven't managed to find much code, but he has some up on GitHub. And I think this is interesting. He said something about mindset. So this is his Swift code for something, but I think this one is nice. Hello world, get destroyed. And he probably has some drive in there. And I'm thinking, many of the stories that I've told are from the late 80s, early 90s, and it's only about boys. And there were some changes that had happened in IT then. When we came start of the 1980s, most people working in IT were women. But then all of a sudden, home computers became available, and computing was sort of a boys' thing. That's changed a lot. And another thing to see or observe is that we do not have any of these stories from present times. There are some, but there are not really those who sit down and learn everything by themselves. And I think what is inspiring about this is the kind of drive that teenagers have. So if it's something that you have as a teenager, it's all the time in the world, and no respect for something being difficult. So no one's thinking, I'm going to scroll the screen on a computer that is not remotely capable of doing that. No one is going to say that that is impossible, and they go and do it. But the thing is, I saw this study that people who started out programming in this period, usually that worked in programming later on, started out programming around the age of 12, 13, 14 years old, whereas the people coming into our industry today start out programming around 18, 19 years old. So there's a huge difference. And we need to find a way to inspire kids of today to actually discover the magical world that is inside a computer. And that is the world you can create yourself in there, where you can be creative and do stuff. Because nowadays, you don't have to write your own games. They come pre-installed. A basic interpreter isn't the first thing that pops up when you turn it on. And it's our responsibility as an industry to actually inspire kids to actually discover that thing. And I want to end this by taking you to the late 1960s, to Lakeside High in the United States of America. So the mothers at Lakeside High had started a petition to get the school to open up a computer lab, because they saw that computers were making a change in society. This would probably be a good educational tool. And they had a bake sale and everything and managed to get a computer terminal set up in one of the rooms. And two of the kids in the school were mesmerized by this one. They spent all the time they had in that computer lab, playing around with the computer, figuring out how this thing worked. They got so addicted that they broke into their school at night to get even more computer time. They got caught, were first expelled from school, and then the headmaster sort of figured out, I have a problem. Every single summer, I have to have two people working the summer through to plan the next semester's time schedules. So I'll give these boys a challenge. I'll ask them to write software that can do that for me, and I'll let them use the computer lab the entire summer through. And these boys were there, sitting there day and night, programming, and actually managing to create this. And in addition, adding an Easter egg so that the younger of the two was allowed to sit next to the girl he was fairly fond of in every single class they had together. Those two were Paul Allen and Bill Gates, and the rest of this story is history, and it just goes to show how far you can get with inspiration and a good dose of healthy teenage engineering. So ladies and gentlemen, this has been the marvels of teenage engineering. Thank you all for coming in. It's been really good being back in London and talking to you all. So have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.